Hello, this is Nathan Branson. For some of you guys, I've never seen you before, so nice to meet you. And I want to go over today The American Scholar by Emerson. We're reading that in class, and so I'm just going to go over some of the main points about Emerson, just so that you have a little bit of context. This essay is, without context, can be a little bit confusing or could be boring, but I'm going to give you some context because whatever he says here is going to be super important as we go into Emerson, as we go into Thoreau and Whitman later. So, just the basics of Emerson. He was considered to be the most influential writer of the 19th century, and a lot of times we can think of him as more of an influencer as opposed to somebody who created great works. He did create really good stuff, but he influenced and inspired a lot of people to create great works like Whitman and Thoreau. What he did was, at the time you had Poe and Irving, who we've read in class, and then he kind of pushed for more authors to do what they were doing in their in fiction, nonfiction, and then also poetry. So it's more of a philosophical perspective that we're reading here as opposed to, it's a nonfiction essay. And like I said, it's more philosophical. Sort of like I like to think of it as a TED Talk. It's a speech. It's not so he's presenting this to a group of people, so keep that in mind. Whenever you hear a speech, it's different than whenever you just read something on paper. I want to make this video just because, like I said, he's influenced a lot of the people we're going to read after this. So for us to read this will give us a good impression on how we read the, Whitman, Melville, Thoreau, and Emily Dickinson. I find that a lot of things he says applies today. Now, you might have to read a page of stuff that's kind of vague. He's kind of vague sometimes, so just hard to understand. But at the same time, you will come across like 2 or 3 paragraphs that apply to you can apply that to 2018 or the 21st century easily. I'll start out with a quote, which is in section 2. And he says, "Meek young men grow up in libraries believing it is their duty to accept the views which Cicero, which Locke, which Bacon have given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were only young men in libraries when they wrote these books." So he's really critical of this Harvard culture that he's in. He's a intellectual in the Boston culture in 1830s. So this is before the Civil War. But what is interesting about that is that he's calling them out to be to think differently, to create their own works, and he's trying to break off from the British influence that America has at the time. And so he's wanting people to what he called man thinking, which is more of somebody who creates their own ideas and then goes and lives those out in the real world, as opposed to just people who are what he calls bookworms. He's pushing back. I don't want to call them stuffy librarians, but he's not wanting people just to be obsessed with the past, and specifically obsessed with English, the English way of doing things, or the European things, the European way. He wants to create an American way. So another quote from this is, "Each age it is found must write its own books, or rather each generation for the next succeeding. The books of an older period will not fit this." So he's hoping that the American Scholar, as this essay is called, that they can create their own, a new way of thinking, as opposed to the American Scholar being a bookworm. He also says, "Books are the best of things, well used, abused among the worst." He says this is bad, that if people are only theoretical, if they're only thinking about what could be, what it was in the past, but they're not acting out what they read in a book, then they're not living to the fullest. And he's all about living out what you believe. And one example of that would be Thoreau. I've got a little chart I want to talk about up here in a minute. We're going to read about Thoreau, and Thoreau was pretty much the epitome of living out what you believe. He did that a whole lot. So one more quote. This is again in section 2. The soul active seeks absolute truth. Another's truth or creates in this action. It is genius, not the privilege of here. And there is a favorite but sound estate of every man. In its essence, it is progressive. The book, the college, the school of art, the institution of any kind stop with the past utterance of genius. This is good, say they. Let us hold to this. They pin me down. They look backward, not forward. But genius looks forward. The eyes of man are set in his forehead, not in his hind head. Man hopes, genius creates. So kind of vague language there at first, but in the middle of that, as he's sort of challenging ideas about the institutions. He says the school of art or even the book, that those are good, but they need to push somebody to go act in the real world, not just reflect on things in the in a classroom. So what are the implications of this? Artistically, he really wanted people to write, especially an American narrative. So if you look at the little chart I've got up here, you have British literature, British literature, you have Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Austen, Shelley, Jane Austen, she wrote Pride and Prejudice, 1818, something like that. Shelley, there's Mary Shelley, she wrote Frankenstein, again, 1818, something like that. Wordsworth was before that. Huge influence. He's like the British equivalent of Emerson. Huge. He's a big deal. He's one of the reasons I became an English major. I like this stuff. And then, of course, you have the greatest writer, Shakespeare. So British has this rich history of cultural identity, English thought, and at the time, America doesn't have as much of that. So they don't have that. At the time, partially, there's a couple of reasons this is, we had Poe and Irving, so they were writing, and we had a lot of nonfiction, but we didn't have as much poetry and not as much, very little fiction in comparison to England, especially. So Emerson wants Americans to push forward in writing their own American identity. Okay, part of this is understandable. At the time, Americans were worried about putting food on the table. They weren't thinking about writing poetry, so they wanted to make sure they had food. They wanted to establish a civilization in America, to establish cities. So, poetry and creating short stories and all that stuff comes later. So, but they needed to figure out who they were first. So it's sort of understandable. But this is 60 years after, 50 to 60 years whenever he wrote this after. So Emerson was pushing after the Declaration of Independence. So Emerson was like, hey, we're kind of settled in. Let's create our own identity and talk about our own identity. And one guy said, Oliver Wendell Holmes, that said that the American Scholar, this essay that we're reading, was the intellectual Declaration of Independence for America. So this is a call to be your own person, or for writers and intellectuals to think of themselves as in their own way, as opposed to just being connected to a European identity. So Emerson wants to push people forward. So one thing that really comes out of this is that if you read this essay, you'll see that he likes books, but he wants people to create. So would he like this class? Actually, I think that Emerson might be a little uncomfortable with the idea that none of us are writing our own works in American literature. He would probably say the ideal American literature class would be to have you as the student write your own poem in my class, write your own short story in my class, not just us talking about Edgar Allan Poe, but also for you to write your own story in a 2018 style. So he would want you to create your own things as opposed to us just thinking about what people have written in the past. So he thinks of it as just not of us repeating what Irving and Equiano and all these other writers have, Whitman said in the past, but also for us to create our own ideas. And this is kind of a big deal in English departments. There's a whole segment of people, a department that is creative writing now. So creative writing focuses on creating, whereas if you just study literature, you're studying what the actual texts are about. You're going to study Shakespeare, you're going to study Whitman and Thoreau, and you're going to explain what those are about. But creative writing focuses on your own creation of your own story in 2018, or fiction or poetry or whatever. So he wants people to be creators, not just readers. He's okay with, like I said, okay with books, but you need to create your own story for your own generation, as he says. And I think we all have our own identity. And there was a break. I'm from North Carolina. I have a Southern accent. So when I go other places, people recognize I have an accent and they say, "Hey, where are you from?" You know, I lived in Arizona for a little time, and people could hear my accent. And I like that I'm from North Carolina. But back in the day, I think about this time, Americans wanted their own identity because they didn't want to be associated with English, the British, because they just went to war with them. So they're trying to break off and create their own culture, as opposed to saying, "Oh yeah, we're still British." No, they're American, and so they're trying to create their own culture. So that's kind of this thing that Emerson's hinting at, which he says in the first paragraph. Perhaps the time has already come when it is to be, and when it will something else. When the sluggard intellect of this continent will look from under its iron lids and feel the postponed expectation of the world with something better than exertions of mechanical skill. So he says the sluggard intellect of this continent. So in other words, he's saying America is intellect needs to develop and to create its own personal identity. So what we have after this is Thoreau and we have Whitman. And both of these guys knew Emerson, and both of these guys were heavily inspired by essays like this. So as you can see, when we read Thoreau, he was seeking to live out in the woods, which is another part of Emerson that I haven't really talked about in this. Is he just loved loved connecting with nature, whereas Whitman wanted to become a voice of that generation right around the Civil War, maybe 10 years after Emerson wrote this. So Emerson, when he read Whitman the first time, he was blown away. So these guys eventually did what Emerson was hoping for, which is to create their own voice. And I just read recently that Emily Dickinson was influenced by Emerson, who we'll read as well, which I didn't know. However, not everybody liked Emerson. Melville thought he was too idealistic. He thought he was unrealistic. But Emerson's known more of super optimistic. If you just Google quotes by Emerson, you're going to get a ton of those inspiring quotes. Whereas Melville, I wouldn't say he's cynical, but he was more of a realist. But he definitely was influenced by Emerson's school of thought, especially about nature. They differed on certain things. So anyways, that's just an overview of the American Scholar. So there's questions online for you to read, and I just wanted to make this lecture just so that it would be easier for me to give you some background information, since this is a little bit just to give you context about what this speech is about. Hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to email me if you have any questions about this particular essay. I will talk to you all later.